President Reagan was nothing if not optimistic and full of love for his country. On September 29, 1982, during remarks at a Virginia Republican Party rally in Richmond, Virginia, he said,
"I hear all those voices every day that say we can't succeed. Well, if we only put our heart and courage to the test, I say we cannot fail. To those who are faint-hearted and unsure, I have this message. If you're afraid of the future, then get out of the way. Stand aside. The people of this country are ready to move again."
Thank you for joining us for this week's Throwback Thursday with President Reagan. Join us next week as we share another inspirational quote.
Just honored to have you here at the Reagan Library.
Well, it's good to be back.
Your book, I read it. It's terrific.
Great.
Is this the kind of project that a lot of, some writers will look at it and say, oh, this is going to be miserable. Do I really want to try to sit down and put all this together? Or was it something you really looked forward to and you had planned it for a long time?
Well, I started out in life to be an academic. And I went to Washington in 1968, and out of that was going to come a dissertation for a PhD, and then I was going to be a professor. And I got caught up in the political wars, went to work in the Nixon and then the Ford administrations, then went home to Wyoming and ran for Congress, and I never got back to the academic world. And I was always leery of that dissertation. It was a big, huge project, and that's as close as I'd come to writing about political life. But then after I finished 40 years, I thought about it in terms of wanting to leave a record for my family, for kids and grandkids, so that one of my descendants 50 or 100 years from now could look back and see what I did and why I did it. And that was sort of the nugget, if you will, that I started with. Then as I got into it, there was great interest. Publishers started talking to me about wanting to publish a book. I also had a great time doing it. And my oldest daughter, Liz Cheney, who's an attorney and done a couple tours of the State Department herself, also the mother of 5, took on the assignment as my co-author. And she sat and listened for 2 years as I told old war stories. Wow. But that's what we put in the book, basically, was sort of the highlights. We had enough material for 4 or 5 books, but we only did one, and tried to cover my life story, basically, and you do that by hitting the high points. And obviously the Reagan administration was an important part of that. I didn't work in the administration, but for the 8 years that Ronald Reagan was president, I was part of the House Republican leadership. We met frequently with the president, and I was involved in a lot of the big issues of the day. Iran-Contra, for example. I was the senior Republican on that investigating committee. So we'd had a lot to talk about.
Yeah, reference to your time as Secretary of Defense, you've had big jobs, as you said, on the House Republican minority leadership side, Secretary of Defense, the Vice Presidency. Is there a way to pinpoint and say, that was my favorite job?
Well, there were a couple of them that really stood out. The being Secretary of Defense at the end of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union collapsed, as we did Desert Storm, and then being there when we brought the troops home after a great victory in the Gulf, and the American people really responded so warmly. I mean, just tremendous outpouring of emotion. And I'm sure a lot of people remember. We took a tape parade up Broadway in New York City, and a big parade in Washington, D.C., and all across the country. It was that way. That it sort of healed the wounds of Vietnam, if you will. I had a lot of Vietnam vets come up to me for years afterwards and say, thank you for what you did. And basically they saw it as proving that the U.S. military was correct and right in what they'd done. And whatever had happened in Vietnam, it wasn't the fault of the troops. So there was a warmth and of relationship there, and great respect and admiration I have for men and women in uniform. Being vice president, was for 8 years during the beginning of the War on Terror, being in the West Wing of the White House on 9/11, and being evacuated because there was an airplane headed our way at 500 miles an hour. It was American 77, eventually went into the Pentagon. But then spending the next 7.5 years working to keep America safe from another attack. Again, worked with some phenomenal people, and we succeeded. So it's moments like those, or periods like those, that I think about where we had the biggest impact.
Mr. Vice President, thanks so much for coming to the Reagan Library.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
I simply can't imagine the last 8 years without Nancy. The presidency wouldn't have been the joy it's been for me without her there beside me. And that second floor living quarters in the White House would have seemed a big and lonely spot without her waiting for me every day at the end of the day.
Romeo had his Juliet, Antony had his Cleopatra, and Ronald Reagan had his beloved Nancy. In this video podcast, we take a look at President and Mrs. Reagan's legendary love story. Charlton Heston once said, theirs was probably the greatest love affair in the history of the American presidency. What began as a meeting between two movie stars became a real-life love story worthy of their own Hollywood movie. They were two famous figures, and even from the beginning, their relationship was played out on a very public stage. First, they were a well-known Hollywood couple, and in a world where romance often cannot survive the attention or temptations that are part of the lifestyle, theirs thrived. Then, as Ronald Reagan entered the political arena, the couple grew only stronger. They were a couple intensely devoted to one another. They were always holding hands. Ronald Reagan visibly lit up when she entered the room. Their devotion to each other seemed at times too good to be true, and some along the way would doubt their sincerity. But there was nothing disingenuous about the Reagans and their obvious affection for one another. Theirs was a genuine love affair. They never took each other for granted, and it has been said that they never stopped courting. During a Larry King interview, Merv Griffin once said of the Reagans, "They were never without each other, and when they went to Washington and she was sort of criticized or a little bit laughed at for her adoring looks at him, well, those are real. And that's the way they are in private. I watched them on long walks. I watched them on the beach in the Bahamas. There was a lot of hand-holding and talking to each other. They are two people who are very, very much in love." They truly could not bear to be apart. Ronald Reagan wrote over 700 letters, cards, and notes to his wife, many illustrated with charming cartoons of his own creations. and she left behind notes and cards for him to find while she was away. In a letter to Nancy Reagan on their 31st wedding anniversary, he wrote, "I more than love you. I'm not whole without you. You are life itself to me. When you are gone, I'm waiting for you to return so I can start living again." The letters and notes span their entire life together. In this February 1977 Valentine's message, he wrote of her, "Feel you should know more about her. For one thing, she has two hearts, her own and mine. I'm not complaining. I gave her mine willingly and like it right where it is." Many years later, when Nancy Reagan published some of the love letters she received from her husband in a book called I Love You, Ronnie, she wrote, "If either of us ever left the room, we both felt lonely. People don't always believe this, but it's true. Feeling the loneliness, completing each other, that's what it still meant to us to be husband and wife." In a tribute to his wife on the occasion of their 40th wedding anniversary in 1992, Ronald Reagan said, "I'll always be grateful that Nancy was at my side along my chosen trails. With Nancy, I soon realized my life was complete. Without her, nothing was impossible." Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this Inside the Reagan Library video. See you soon.
Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs Programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you Congresswoman Liz Cheney, the United States Representative for Wyoming's at-large congressional district. She was first elected in 2016 on a platform of restoring America's strength and power in the world. She serves on the House Armed Services Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. The Reagan Foundation has been very fortunate to have her at the Reagan Library on numerous occasions for in-person events, but this time she joined us virtually to discuss how the GOP can better engage young and women voters, the ongoing protests engulfing our country, and the importance of United States leadership in the world. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program with Congresswoman Liz Cheney and the director of the Reagan Institute, Roger Zakheim.
This is Roger Zakheim coming from the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., the D.C. office of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Welcome you to Reaganism, and our guest today is Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Great to be with you as always, and always love to participate in any of the terrific events the Reagan Institute hosts. So thanks for having me, Roger.
Well, we appreciate that, and no good deed goes unpunished from participating in the Reagan National Defense Forum. Now we have you on the podcast, so we greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely.
A lot to cover today. So much is going on here in Washington, D.C. and across the country. But just for our listeners, many people know you because you are the lone congresswoman from the state of Wyoming, of course, the daughter of a vice president. But your life and going in and out of Washington certainly dates back further than when your father became vice president. Of course, he was a chief of staff during the Ford administration, and then, like you, served in the Congress. What has that been like, kind of a lifetime almost, of coming in and out of Washington with public office, either you're in public office or a family member, and then going back to life outside the Beltway?
Well, I feel like it's been an incredibly blessed way to grow up, and to have had the opportunity to sort of see both worlds. But certainly many of my earliest memories have to do with my mom and dad and their public service. When my dad was chief of staff for President Ford back in the early 70s, and my sister and I were young, and he would take us down to the White House on Saturday mornings to have breakfast with him, and because, as you can imagine, his schedule was very busy. And we would sit on the floor of his office in the West Wing, which is still the chief of staff's office today. At that time, the very high tech nature of the tools that the chief of staff had at the ready involved multiple televisions. And I can remember Mary and I being so impressed that, there was a wall that had like 4 televisions on it. So you could watch cartoons on every network simultaneously.
Keep the press and cartoons going on all at once.
I feel like we probably changed them all to cartoons. So, those were the days when you could only watch cartoons on Saturday mornings on networks. So
being a kid in Washington, you had the White House as a venue, and then after that, the Congress as a venue, right? Because then soon after your father left, after the Ford administration, and during certainly the Reagan years, he was, like you, in the leadership in the Republican conference. Was that a fun place to be as well?
Yeah, I think that was really the first taste that I had. We campaigned across Wyoming as a family, and walking in parades, and knocking on doors and handing out buttons, and just really learning what it means to participate in the political process. There was really wonderful memories, especially that first campaign. And of course, in the middle of that first campaign, my dad had his first heart attack. And so there was a sort of a period of time there where we weren't sure whether he was going to continue to run. And my mom took over. We campaigned with her. But no, it was really just a wonderful way to get to understand how politics works in our country.
I never asked you that. So seeing your mom campaign, of course, as your father was recovering, that is well known. But seeing a woman in that role, was that kind of a moment where in your mind you were like, yeah, I'm going to do that?
It's interesting. Mary and I both were just so blessed to grow up with parents for whom the issue of our gender never even occurred to me, I'm sure to Mary, that would be an obstacle to anything we wanted to do. It was just an issue that was not even discussed. I remember growing up, and my mother was writing and teaching, and one of the first things that I read was an article that she wrote about Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman doctor in the United States. And so for us, it was just, we knew that if we were willing to work hard enough, that we shouldn't be denied opportunity because of our gender. And so
it was a matter of course.
Yeah, exactly. It didn't even it certainly didn't occur to me that being a woman would be an obstacle. And I think we were just always expected to work hard and prove ourselves, and certainly grew up knowing how important it was to fight for what's right.
But you really did straddle in terms of the world of politics and policy to both. You had that exposure you just referenced from your years when your father was in the Congress and campaigning as a family in Wyoming. And then, later on, of course, he becomes Secretary of Defense and then Vice President, and you served in the Bush 43 administration in the State Department. So how'd you go from kind of looking at things from a family of politics then to working in the policy world of Foggy Bottom?
Well, I think, first of all, for us, the policy and the politics have always been completely intertwined. And again, I know, when we would sit around the dinner table as kids, the discussions were usually about what was happening in the world then. And politics is a very important way to make sure that you can get the right policies in place and the right people elected to do that. So I've always seen those as really intertwined. I've also always been very interested in and focused on the Middle East, and something that I really became interested in for the first time when I was about 10 or 11 years old, reading about King Tut in history class. But then worked on that throughout the years. Worked on it when I was in private practice, working on business deals in the Middle East. Worked on it at the International Finance Corporation, and then when I went into the State Department. It was actually my second time into the State Department, though. The first time during the first Bush 41, working on aid programs to former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe right when the wall came down.
That's a fascinating
and
period.
Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic were all opening up. So
I want to get back to that, but you were mentioning before that for you it was a matter of course that as a woman, should you pursue it and have the ambition, elective office, be it from Wyoming or any place else, was reachable and doable. Of course, now we are looking at an election here in a few months. One of the areas of focus in your role as chair of the Republican conference and in the House leadership is thinking about getting Republicans elected come November in the House of Representatives, and particularly one area of focus has been getting women elected. Your colleague Elise Stefanik has been highly focused on it, and then I believe the 197 Republicans, maybe just a little more than a dozen, maybe 13 are women. So the matter, of course, in your mind hasn't actually played out. Give me your perspective on one, why that is the case, and two, your thoughts about changing that number.
Well, I think first of all, the number is way too low. We've got to do everything we can to get more women elected, more Republican women. Secondly, it's not an accident that the number is so low. I think it's important to remember that, Speaker Pelosi was really effective at targeting our women, particularly if you look across California. You look at the kinds of tactics that the Democrats have put in place, things like ballot harvesting and others. That have really particularly helped to ensure, in some places, I think unfairly, that our women and our men candidates have been beaten.
Ballot harvesting, just for those who may not be as familiar with the nomenclature of elections and different things that take place to shape outcomes, what is that reference?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as an example, Young Kim, who's again running in California. Young Kim, we thought had been elected. She had more votes on election day. She won the election. But then as absentee ballots came in, and ballot harvesting really refers to a tactic that the Democrats have used extensively in California, where they have volunteers and sometimes not volunteers, sometimes people who are paid, who basically go around and collect absentee ballots, make sure that people that may not know that they could vote, even if they frankly are not here legally, or if they're not really qualified to vote, help to get those people ballots and help to ensure that anybody who can get any kind of access to an absentee ballot votes, and then they harvest those ballots, they go and collect them basically. We believe that you should only be able to vote if you actually legally are qualified to vote. We think one thing that's really important is we got to clean up voter rolls so that people who are able to vote, who do have the vote, who are legally qualified, don't have their vote diluted by people who shouldn't be voting and who are frankly abusing the system.
So are you optimistic that the number of elected women in the Republican House will increase this election cycle?
I am. We've got just a tremendous number of very well-qualified candidates across the board. And I also think, I think it's important that we not just elect women, because of course there are some women like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. We need fewer of those kinds of members of Congress. I think they have a set of views that are dangerous. But I think that we need to encourage women to jump in. We need to encourage people who may be sort of sitting back thinking they don't have the experience or the expertise to go ahead and take the leap, and to recognize how important it is to have their voice at the table.
Another just thinking about Republicans, electoral prospects, and some of the challenges is young people. President Trump, I think, trailed his opponent in the demographic between 18 and 29-year-old by 30, I want to say 30 points in 2016. What are your thoughts about getting that group of Americans, the 18 to 29-year-olds, to support and vote Republicans and share kind of the outlook of a Liz Cheney?
I think that a lot of it has to do with the kinds of things that, frankly, Ronald Reagan spoke about and stood for. And the idea of what we need to make sure that everybody in this society can prosper is we need freedom, we need equality of opportunity, we need people to recognize and understand that the fight against socialism is a fight that goes fundamentally to whether or not we can exercise the individual rights that our Constitution guarantees. And I think Reagan, Thatcher too, were so important, obviously historically, but so important at laying out the terms of that debate and at explaining to people what happens when nations adopt socialism. I think, unfortunately, today, too many young people are attracted to the idea of socialism. Too many young people, I think, view that as somehow a more equitable way to organize society, when in fact, what it does is it steals power from every single individual and gives it to the federal government. And I think we need to really do a better job at making those kinds of points so that young people understand that their future, their ability to affect the future, their ability to make decisions for themselves and their families ultimately requires that we protect freedom. And protecting freedom can't be done if you're trying to expand government control and impose socialism.
I want to drill down on that point for a second, because one of the things that is not well known and is perhaps not intuitive is President Reagan's support amongst those in that same demographic we're discussing, 18 to 29-year-olds. When he left office, that group supported him by some polls over like 90%.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And he was, I think it's fair to say he was old by the time he left office, right?
Right.
So we talk about why that was the case. I think part of it is what you just captured. What was he talking about? This idea of freedom, in particular, having a kind of a substantive approach to talking about what's on the mind of a young person, also about their future, was also
Right.
something that was a key component of what he spoke about. I mean, it was how President Reagan looked at individuals, but also spoke about the country, very much future oriented. Do you think the Republicans that you see going out there running for office across the country, you have better insight than almost anybody, are focusing both about freedom? I mean, obviously you're highly involved in discussions about China and democratic socialism, but also kind of how that ties to a young person's future.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, I think we need to do more of it. I think that there's a tendency sometimes for candidates to think, oh, people don't really care about foreign policy. They don't really care about national security. The Reagan Institute has done really important polling on these issues. And I just think that that's wrong. And I think it's dangerous for candidates to assume that. And I think that what, our obligation is to ensure that people recognize we're facing a real choice right now. It is absolutely the case that when you look at the future of sort of the international global order, either the United States and the nations that defend freedom and believe fundamentally in freedom are going to determine what that looks like, or the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, and the leaders of the Chinese government are going to make that determination. That is absolutely the battle that's underway right now. And I think young people, when they realize it, when they see what's happening, when they see the treatment of the Uyghurs, when they see what's happened in Hong Kong, when they see the extent to which doctors who spoke out about COVID have been disappeared, those are things we need to do more to make sure people understand fundamentally the difference here. This is not a moral equivalence. This really is a situation where there is one power, which is totalitarian, which is communist, which absolutely will repress and oppress its people, will kill people who disagree with them, versus, the United States of America, which has always, though absolutely we are not perfect, and we're going through right now domestically the kinds of protests you're seeing on issues around race. But our belief and defense of freedom is unmatched and unparalleled around the world and in history. We have to make sure we stand
I
up
want
for
to
that.
go back in a moment. We'll really drill down into China and this competition, not just from a security standpoint, which you lead on and have tremendous depth on, but also as you were referencing the kind of the competition of political ideas. But you just hit on what's going on at home, and I want to kind of focus on that for a couple of minutes. We have protests around police brutality and racism in this country. Quick, just give me your take in terms of George Floyd and what it's triggered across the country, and how you, as a member of Congress, a leader in the Congress, is going to kind of take that and address it, if at all, in the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, the killing of George Floyd was horrific. And I think everyone who has seen that video recognizes that it was horrific. One of the signs that I've seen in the protests that I think is particularly moving is a sign that I've seen several protesters with that says, when George Floyd called out for his mother, he summoned all mothers. And I don't think that any of us who is a mother is unmoved by that. I think that we cannot live in a society where mothers of Black children have to worry that because of the color of their skin or their children's skin, that when they leave the house, they could find themselves killed by those who are supposed to be protecting us. I think that it's an issue we have to address and we have to deal with as a society. But I also think that it is absolutely wrong for us to say that we are going to somehow condemn all police officers. I think that the moves that you've seen in the last 48 hours to say that we're going to defund police, just ludicrous. And I think that, what we will see, what does worry me is you will see good people decide they are not going to go into law enforcement. Good people say, I don't need to put my life on the line every day if this is going to be a situation where I don't have the resources I need, where I don't have the support I need, or where I'm going to be tarred by, what has happened with people, like the officer who killed George Floyd.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, as a government, I think what we need to do is encourage, first of all, transparency. We need to make sure that we are dealing with recruiting issues. There's no way that somebody that had as many complaints against them as that officer did, both before he joined the force and after, should be on the force at all. And I think we need to do a better job.
Which I believe he was doing too. I mean,
Pardon me?
Let alone training other officers.
Exactly. And I think that's another place where we need to make sure that we've got a much stronger mentoring program. So there's no question but that there are things that we can do and things that police forces around the country want help with and want support for. And I think that's important. But, when I see things like some of the graffiti, the attacks, I mean, I watched as your building was being broken into. I saw that, as it was happening on the live stream, and the windows shattered. The graffiti that's been painted all over the mall and on the World War II memorial, and the rioting and the looting that's gone on. I think that, that does a real damage to obviously our neighborhoods and the communities, a number of them where you've got, Black store owners and other minorities store owners who have built those businesses. People's lives are on the line, and we have to be able to sit and listen to each other and talk about these issues. And we all have to come together to stand against that kind of rioting and taking advantage of what is a really important moment for the country.
Yeah, and you were just talking about police and law enforcement. As you referenced before, the Reagan Institute has done surveys, and we ask on the question of trusted institutions across the United States. And police and law enforcement do really well consistently year over year. That in our poll, Americans said really overwhelmingly 74% that they have great or some confidence in police and law enforcement. Do you see that degraded as a result of this? Do you think that number we will see go down, and trust and confidence in the police will lower to the point that we have a problem?
I hope not, certainly, Roger. And I think that a lot of this has to do with making sure that we're having this conversation in a way that reflects reality. You know, one of my colleagues, Pete Stauber from Minnesota, served on the police force for over 20 years. And when you talk to Pete about what's going on in Minneapolis and across the country, you know, Pete says that the police departments that are most effective are those that police with their communities, those that know the people in the communities, that work together, people who live in those communities and who are in any community who are trying to raise their families, want security. They want to know that the police are going to be there to protect them. They want to know that the stores aren't going to be looted. They want to know that, you know, if the retired police officer Dorn, who was trying to protect a store from looting and was killed in cold blood. I mean, I think those are the kinds of things that all of society needs to come together to stand against. And I think those are the police forces that are policing with those communities are the ones that are most effective. And those are the ones we also ought to have a way that we can more effectively share best practices around the country, so that the police forces that are doing the right thing and that are working with their communities ought to be able to share their lessons across the.
It's almost like you know, the most important data is how local communities view their local law enforcement police force, right? You know,
That's right.
poor analogy would be if you were graded by the way the country views the U.S. Congress, you wouldn't be reelected. However, if you were graded by how those in Wyoming view you, you do remarkably well, and that's probably more important. You know, this is all going on, of course, amidst this pandemic, COVID-19,
Right.
and you know, it's every city and locality and state is taking their own approach. When we think about the origins of COVID-19, you and others have really focused on China, and in particular, how the Chinese Communist Party conducted themselves in terms of transparency and making the world aware of what was going to come, and quite fatal, taking the lives of more than 100,000 Americans and scores more across the globe. Talk to us a little bit about your take on COVID-19 and another entry point discussing China as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, first of all, there's been this big debate about whether or not the Chinese Communist Party, the government of China, knowingly spread the virus. And in my view, that question has been answered. And as soon as you recognize the fact that they stopped travel from Wuhan into the rest of China, and they allowed travel from Wuhan into the rest of the world, they knew they had transmission from human to human, and they knew it, and that's why they stopped the travel into the rest of China. But the fact that at that time they allowed travel into the rest of the world, that's the only answer that you need. Now, we will be looking at, you know, continuing to look at, did it come from the lab? Did it come from the wet market? All of those questions are important. But in terms of culpability, we know the answer. They caused the virus to be spread around the globe, causing economic devastation. And, you know, 110,000 Americans at this point have been killed. So this is devastation at the hands of the Chinese.
That's almost enough. I mean, that mere conduct enough. It really does. The rest of it could be, you know, interesting, but it doesn't change.
Exactly. And look, I think this is just speculation on my part, but I think that the Chinese government made a very clear calculation. I think they knew they had human to human transmission. They knew it was going to cause economic devastation. And they understood that if they did not allow it to transmit into the rest of the world, the devastation was only going to hit China. And I think that they made a calculation that they would rather be in a position, frankly, where that devastation was spread globally, so it was not only affecting China negatively. But it is absolutely a situation in which they are culpable. And it is only the latest example and the worst, obviously, the most damaging example of the nature of that regime and their inability and unwillingness to operate as part of the civilized community of nations.
So, you know, another facet which you are uniquely kind of qualified and have experience to address is the World Health Organization, an institution perhaps most Americans were not familiar with. You certainly are from your time in the Congress and also in the State Department. International organizations like the World Health Organization have to straddle countries that are competitors or even adversaries. But in this case, there's been a lot of criticism in terms of how the World Health Organization was complicit in terms of the Chinese, we'll call it, narrative with respect to COVID-19. President Trump, of course, has talked about, and perhaps already implemented, it kind of is hard to pin down, defunding or not funding or something of that nature with respect to the World Health Organization. What's your take on the WHO and how, from a U.S. policy standpoint, we should or should not engage with multinational institutions like the WHO when they are complicit, if you take that view, with the conduct of a Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, I think that the WHO has hugely important work that we expect it to do. Whether even before you get to the issues of COVID, when you're talking about issues related to Ebola, to HIV/AIDS, there are really important things that WHO was expected to do before the era of COVID. And the problem is, when you get into looking at what's happened with COVID, it's not just that they've been pushing the Chinese Communist Party storyline, but that storyline has prevented us from being able to stop the spread of the disease. And so when they were, basically pushing out the talking points that you saw coming out of China with respect to, you don't have to worry about human-to-human transmission and it's contained, and all of those things that the Chinese wanted people to think, but turns out wasn't true. I think that puts the WHO in a position where they're the organization that's supposed to be helping to save lives, but probably took action that cost lives. And I think that the United States has to hold these international organizations accountable.
Mm-hmm.
They can be very important, but I think that for too long, what's gone on, and you've seen this too, anybody who's spent time working, for example, up at the United Nations, as I did when I was at the State Department, working with any of these international organizations, there can be, and there tends to be, very strong anti-American bias in a number of them, not to mention
the Secretariat you're talking about, actually the professional workforce that supports almost the executive branch, as it were, for the United Nations.
Exactly. And of course, then you get into the, thank goodness we pulled out of the Human Rights Commission at the UN, but the fact that you've got countries like, Libya on the Human Rights Commission just tells you kind of what a farce these organizations have become. And they're getting, tens of millions of taxpayer dollars every year. So I think that the president has done the right thing in terms of saying we aren't going to continue to provide that kind of financial support if these organizations aren't doing the job they were intended to do, if they've become just a forum to bash America, and if, as is the case with the WHO, they're probably causing lives rather than saving them. I think that it's important to have a WHO of some kind. It's important to track global pandemics so we can work together to defeat them. But when those organizations become as politicized as they have, and that's not an accident, the government of China is working very hard and very aggressively in many instances to cede those very same secretariat positions you mentioned with people who are supportive of and beholden to them. And I think it's dangerous.
It really is dangerous, and it really comes down to, how do you hold these institutions accountable? How do you hold China accountable for their conduct? I mean, amidst COVID, you had China passing a national security law for Hong Kong, right? Yeah. Another example of where taking an international agreement between, actually in this case, the United Kingdom and China with respect to Hong Kong, one country, two systems, allowing Hong Kong to remain independent and democratic, that's been walked back almost by every expert's account with this national security law amidst this COVID pandemic. What is the U.S. role? I mean, you're a big advocate of the U.S. Maintaining its leadership role in the world, and in particular, as you discussed earlier in this discussion, with respect to freedom and democracy. Give me your take on what's going on with Hong Kong, the national security law, and the U.S. role.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's a crucially important issue, and I think that um, the United States is uniquely positioned to be able to lead the nations of the free world. There really is no other country that can do that, no other country that will do that. And there, if you look at books like "The Jungle Grows Back" by Bob Kagan, which came out a couple of years ago, where Kagan talks about, and I agree with him, that it is not an accident that for the last 75 years, we have lived through a time of unparalleled peace and prosperity and freedom. It is because the nation that was the most powerful on earth, had the strongest economy and the strongest military, was the United States of America, which was fundamentally based, founded on, believed in the values of the Enlightenment, the values of freedom. We are uniquely able to lead the world, and we should. We should because it's right, and we should because it's necessary for our continued security and freedom and prosperity. And that idea is being tested today in the United States. It's being tested in our political debates that are going on, and it's being tested globally. The government of China would love for people to believe that democracy is just too messy. That's sort of their line. It's too messy. It's too complicated. You really ought to, throw your lot in with us, with China. They're going around the world blackmailing countries, to accept infrastructure, blackmailing countries over Huawei and 5G. Many countries now, because of COVID, are beginning to understand that that's a deal with the devil, beginning to understand the tremendous cost of entering into those arrangements with China. Certainly, government of China has even been blackmailing countries over medical supplies to help
Right.
them respond to COVID.
That actually didn't work.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I think we've seen positive moves now, for example, from the government of the UK, recognizing that if they do allow Huawei to play the role in their 5G that they have, discussed, it's going to put at risk our intel sharing relationship with them. And I think COVID has just laid bare absolutely the true nature of that regime.
One of the things that really stands out with respect to China and U.S. views of China and U.S. leadership in the world is that you recall the poll that we did at the end of last year, where almost 70% of Americans, 68% of those polled, support the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, even if it angers China. Of course, that's before COVID-19.
Yeah.
Something that I think at times President Trump would be surprised to hear, and certainly those on the other side of the aisle from you also may not believe, or certainly don't think that's the role for America. But it seems overwhelming to me that Americans support standing by those with freedom. Maybe they don't support boots on the ground to do that, but certainly rhetorically and other things we can do on the economic front and the political front, there seems to be very strong support for.
Yeah, and I think it is bipartisan actually. I think that when you think about and you look at what America has stood for and why, standing with those who are fighting for freedom is really important. And I think it goes back to, again, Natan Sharansky famously talked about how much it meant, what a difference it made to him and his fellow political prisoners in the Gulag when Ronald Reagan spoke about them, when Ronald Reagan spoke about America standing up for prisoners of conscience. And I think that's what America should be, and it's a tremendous strength for us. And so I think that, unfortunately, because we're in an election year right now, you do see the more partisanship around these issues connected to U.S. policy towards China than you otherwise would. But even before COVID, if you'd asked me what is an issue on which there is bipartisan agreement, I would have said taking a stronger policy position towards the government of China. I think that is something that you'll find. And now, in the aftermath of COVID, I would bet, if it weren't for Speaker Pelosi trying to sort of impose her way and not participate for partisan reasons in our China task force, you'd find strong majorities in both parties know we have to hold China
This, of course, is
accountable.
the task force in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, now made up of Republican members of Congress, looking at all aspects of the challenges posed by China. Did I get that right?
That's right. And it's chaired by Mike McCall, who's the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. There are about 15 of us on the task force. We're looking at issues ranging from national security strategy, including sort of what we need to do at the Pentagon, what we need to do about economic warfare, cybersecurity, ideology, really looking across the board at the relationship with China and what the United States needs to do to ensure that we maintain our supremacy and to ensure that we protect ourselves as well.
I want to get back to the Pentagon and national security since you're such a strong leader on those subjects. But before we do, I just want to close out the discussion we had on Hong Kong, because I am no doubt if there's someone listening, perhaps who's very focused on what's going on in the country right now, the question will arise, are we really in a position, do we have any moral authority to stand with those in Hong Kong protesting for their own freedom and democracy, when to many Americans on the streets protesting right now, they'll say, listen, we have our own challenges, right? We have our own difficulties, as you referenced before, with racism and police brutality. Do we even have a footing to stand on to talk to others, particularly the Chinese Communist Party, about their assault on freedom and democracy?
Well, I think certainly the Chinese Communist Party would like to draw an equivalence there. And I think that, for example, they're members of the Chinese Communist Party, members of the government of China, who have been very active on Twitter, which I think is interesting and ironic, given that, certainly nobody in their country could be active on Twitter if they wanted to. I don't even think can get access to Twitter for the most part. So
it only goes in one direction there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can't tweet
Right.
it.
That's right. So I think they would like to draw that parallel. Of course, it's completely wrong. Of course, the United States of America has, throughout its history, gone through periods of time where we have been able to come together, improve the country, improve fundamentally the extent to which our freedoms apply to everybody. When the Constitution was first adopted, of course, we had slavery in this country. Women couldn't participate. And we have made huge strides to help to perfect this republic, and we will continue to work on that. But we are a society based on freedom and based on the notion that you can publicly assemble, that you can criticize your government, that you can speak out. And I know the government of China would like people to think that there's some moral equivalence, but when they have been in the last several months killing doctors for speaking out, when they've been silencing political opponents for years, when you look at the death toll, hundreds of millions killed throughout the reign of the Chinese Communist Party, there's just simply no comparison. So, each time that I see any of the members of the government of China try to engage on Twitter and suggest that somehow, they welcome open debate and discussion, I always applaud those who send back to those members of the government names of individuals who've been disappeared to say, listen, let's start the discussion by talking to these doctors who simply, no longer exist. You've probably killed them, but let's talk to some of the people that you've disappeared. It's one of the reasons why we passed legislation to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C.
Right.
After Dr. Li Wenliang, who was the first to notify and warn the world about COVID.
It's marching towards a more perfect union, right? And that's fundamentally, we have a system that allows for that. We have a Bill of Rights that provides for that opportunity. And we celebrate when our citizens do that. And those are a set of points that the Chinese Communist Party can never make because it just, their system does not allow for it. And in fact, it prevents it.
I think too, Roger, it's important to say that, the mere fact that they feel that they have to pretend that their system is like ours really tells you something about the weakness of their system. They cannot sell their system. They cannot let people actually choose, because nobody would choose communism. Nobody would choose the Chinese Communist Party if they actually had a fair vote. So they can't afford that, but they do know that that's fundamentally what people want and believe in. So they have to pretend that their system has that freedom, even when it's very, very clumsy attempts that people know are simply propaganda.
Great point. And I could talk about this with you for more time than you have or you would want. I want to hit on one last point, which is a challenge you'll face, no doubt, in the next Congress, perhaps before, and then we'll get to our Reagan lightning round.
All right.
What are you participating in that one? But you mentioned the Pentagon. We've talked about COVID. One of the pieces of the COVID crisis has, of course, been the stimulus that the Congress has passed and the tremendous amount of spending, of course, the federal government has done to help manage the economic crisis, the economic component of COVID-19. That has led to many saying, okay, we have to get our house in order when it comes to spending, which is cyclical in Washington. And the last time we really went through this in a serious way was after the Great Recession and the need to get our spending together. That is inevitable, I think many people believe. Always the first on the list of things that will have to be cut, and where perhaps those on the right and on the left will agree, is our defense budget, our spending to support the Pentagon and the military. Do you anticipate that there will be defense cuts in our future, regardless of the outcome of the election?
Well, I certainly hope not, and will fight, as hard as possible, and I know my colleagues will as well, to prevent that. As you know, Roger, we're already in a situation where the Joint Chiefs have said repeatedly we've got to have 3 to 5% real growth annually in order to be able to carry out the missions in the National Defense Strategy. We're not there. We're flat this year, which, when you factor in inflation, is actually a reduction.
Right.
So that's even before COVID and before the tremendous impact of COVID on the force in terms of having to cancel exercises and other things. So I think we're in a situation where we have to make sure that we don't see those kinds of cuts. And I think that, as you pointed out, certainly because of the resources that we've had to appropriate for COVID, there is absolutely a necessity, and there was before that, to look at the debt. I think the debt is a national security crisis and challenge. We can't ever balance the budget on the back of the Defense Department, though. And I think that when you see things happening, frankly, like the announcement that we just had over the weekend that the president might be ordering the withdrawal of forces out of Germany,
Right.
I think that's a huge mistake. And this is a moment where we need to be clear with our allies and clear for our adversaries that we are not going to abandon our allies, that we are not going to abandon the role that the United States has played in the world that has kept us safe and free. And in fact, the cost of abandoning that role in the world ultimately will be much higher. The cost of inaction, if you think about a world in which China sets the rules, or Iran or North Korea, the cost of us failing to act now will be almost immeasurable later. And so I think that it's crucially important that we not go down that path.
Yeah, and that almost gets to Bob Kagan's point that the 75-year period that we've enjoyed this freedom and this prosperity, which the freedom delivers, came because we made those serious investments in guaranteeing the free flow of goods and the spread of freedom. What's interesting is I think most people would assume that it's good politics to bring to close bases, let's say in Germany, which reported the president plans to do. But President Obama advocated doing the same thing to rebuild at home. But we've seen in our polling that actually overwhelming number of Americans support. I think the number was 65%, maintaining U.S. bases overseas because they believe and understand that those bases actually are the guarantor of freedom and prosperity and the commerce that delivers it. From a political standpoint, is there an effective way to kind of capture that? Because of course, if they believe those bases are there to engage in armed conflict, right, and you have 100,000 boots on the ground fighting, let's say in Iraq and Afghanistan, all of a sudden politically that's a big loser, right? How do you straddle that line when you talk to your constituents and other members of Congress?
Well, I really think that it comes down to the facts. It comes down to when you're talking about what our forces in Afghanistan are needed to do there, we're talking about maintaining a presence that allows us to prevent terrorists from forming safe havens. And Americans would much rather be able to prevent the establishment of safe havens elsewhere, be able to fight terrorists elsewhere than having to fight them here inside the United States. And I think that's a very basic fact about what's necessary in order to be able to continue our counterterrorism, our intelligence operations in the Middle East. Well, when you're talking about Europe, when you're talking about Korea, those are partnerships. Those are places where our forces have been stationed for years, not because we're at war in Europe, but because we know we have to deter, because we know the best way to prevent aggression, for example, by the Russians, or in Asia by the Chinese, is to work with our allies to maintain the peace. I think that, Jeane Kirkpatrick and Ronald Reagan, the notion of peace through strength really means something. And weakness invites aggression. And I think that is a lesson that, the Rand Pauls of the world never seem to recognize. It's a lesson that we seem to have to learn, generation after generation, to relearn it. But defending ourselves means that we have a military that is second to none, that we have the capacity and the will to take action if we are threatened, and that we will do that. And that is how you prevent people from taking action against us. That's how you ensure you don't actually have to go to war, because people know that if they attack us, if they threaten our interests, if they threaten our allies, we'll respond. And I think ultimately, as we start to, see these moves to pull our forces home and to walk away from those alliances, look, NATO is the single most effective alliance in the history of mankind, I would be willing to say. Certainly the single most effective military alliance. In terms of what NATO has managed to prevent, in terms of the freedom that NATO has managed to guarantee. And it's no wonder that Vladimir Putin would like to see NATO diminished. And I think it's really important that the United States of America not help him attain that objective.
We're going to jump to the lightning round. Great words by Congresswoman Cheney. Lightning round, just to remind you, is where we ask all our guests of the Reaganism podcast to share with us their favorite quote from President Reagan, or it could be when he was Governor Reagan, or time in between he was in office. Favorite speech, and or favorite book about the 40th president. So you can share with us either one, two, or all three. Over to you.
Well, there are so many to choose from, as you know, Roger. But my dad and I wrote a book several years ago called Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Powerful America. And the beginning of the book is a Ronald Reagan quote. And so I'm going to actually read it, because it's a really important quote. I want to make sure I get it exactly right. But
we welcome that here.
This is from March 23rd, 1983. President Reagan said, "It is up to us in our time to choose, and choose wisely, between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom, and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best, while the enemies of freedom grow stronger day by day." And I think that quote really describes the duty and the obligation of the United States of America, through all times, and particularly today. It's much easier to look the other way. It's much easier to say we aren't going to continue to stand up for freedom around the world. But if we do that, it will strengthen the enemies of freedom, and that puts our own security at risk.
We'll have to leave it there, Congresswoman Cheney. Thank you so much for joining the Reaganism podcast. We look forward to having you back on the show in the not too distant future.
Thanks, Roger. Always great to be with you.
Thank you for joining us for today's virtual programming event. We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number one about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.